Do you think the Toronto housing market is crazy? Do you think some of the prices are insane? Well, you're not alone. And in this video, we're gonna cover off some of the reasons why this market is so crazy and why some of these prices are really insane. And stay tuned till the end because I'm gonna answer the #1 question that I get asked, and that is, would I buy in this market? And I think my answer is gonna surprise you. So let's get to it. Hi everybody, my name is Connie Sarvanandan and I'm a real estate agent and investor here in Toronto and the GTA. And if this is your first time to my channel, please like and subscribe and make sure you hit that little bell button so that you know every single time that we put out a video. We help clients from around the world and we absolutely love it. So if you have any real estate questions or needs, please call, text, email, or WhatsApp, and we'll be sure to take care of you. So Toronto housing is insane. And here's the thing about Toronto housing. It's insane and it's been insane for a long time. The average price point in Toronto continues to rise. In 2009, the average price point in Toronto for housing was about $400,000. In 2019, 10 years later, it was about $800,000. Today, it's over $1 million. So it continues to grow and grow and grow. So why is that? Well, here are the reasons why I think our market continues to grow despite us reaching such high levels when it comes to the average price point. So the first thing is interest rates. Interest rates are at historic lows. And when COVID hit, the Canadian government dropped our interest rates even more. So what does that mean? Well, that means with lower interest rates, you could afford more. And so when buyers had the ability to afford more, they were spending more, which caused a cycle of increasing prices. So lower interest rates are here today. They think that they're going to rise somewhat in 2022, but they're still historically low to what we have seen throughout history. When my parents owned a home, they were paying an interest rate of double digits. They had a mortgage in the 80s and they were paying sometimes 15% interest. And now we're paying, less than 3%. So there's a huge difference, which means that, people are spending more because they can afford more. Now, the Canadian government has put in some things like the stress test into mortgage applications, which means that they do take into account some rise in interest rates when they're calculating how much you could afford. But that said, we're still at historic lows, which contributes to the crazy housing market and crazy housing prices. The next thing is immigration and housing stock. In a nutshell, what it means is we're getting a lot of new immigrants, yet we're not producing enough housing to supply these new immigrants. And this is not just true for Toronto and the GTA, but it's true for Ontario and Canada as a whole. From 2016 to 2019, we had a million new permanent residents come into the country. A million. And in 2019 alone, we gave out 400,000 student visas. And a lot of those students end up staying in Canada. So we're getting a lot of immigration, yet we're not producing enough housing stock to keep up with that immigration. And the one example I'm going to give you is the Golden Horseshoe. So the Golden Horseshoe is an area that surrounds Toronto. And from 2016 to 2021, the Golden Horseshoe increased their population by about 780,000 people. And in the same time period, they built housing stock of about 270,000 new homes. So you can clearly see the discrepancy between the two. Now, it's not one for one because obviously housing versus individuals, there's a different makeup. But what you can clearly see is that there's not enough housing to address the new immigration. And so what happens as a result of that is you get more people competing for fewer units that are available. And this is true from a rental and a buying perspective. So that's definitely contributing to the housing crisis across the board and to prices. So the next thing is COVID. COVID did have an effect on our housing market. And that's because at the beginning of COVID, all of us had to work from home. And so some of us were lucky in that we had a home office already, but for most of us, we were trying to create a home office. And so what you saw is people were starting to upsize because they were looking for properties that had a home office. And you did see a migration out of downtown Toronto. So people were leaving their small condos downtown, whether they were buying, whether they owned or rented, and they were moving to bigger units. And you actually saw a dip in the Toronto downtown housing market and in the rental market for a little bit. It's all come back now. Now there's, tons of activity on Toronto downtown condos, whether it be rental or buying. But at the beginning of COVID, for sure, there was a dip. And so people were looking for bigger units that could have a home office. And they were also actually looking for in areas that they hadn't considered before because all of a sudden they didn't have the commute time. So that definitely contributed to people buying houses, also a lot more people vying for the same house. And so it definitely contributed to the craziness and the bidding wars within the city. The other thing I will say is that now everybody has come back, and Toronto housing, especially downtown Toronto, seems to be back to normal. I had clients who were renting and looking in downtown Toronto, and they actually faced some bidding wars for their rental because there was a lot of people interested in the units that they wanted. So definitely back to normal, and COVID definitely contributed to the housing market in Toronto. The next thing is, it's partly due to COVID, but for other reasons, is telecommuting. So COVID really kind of showed the world that you could telecommute, and there was lots of people that could work from anywhere and do their jobs. And so that has really contributed to the overall housing piece as well, because now people didn't have to work within a certain vicinity to their office. And so what you saw was this huge migration to communities that hadn't seen activity at this level ever before. And so you had an increasing activity across the board. And then within Toronto itself, you also had people moving to the outer reaches of Toronto because they could work from home and you wouldn't have a crazy commute time. Commute time in Toronto and the GTA is a problem, but COVID really took away that problem. And so people were buying everywhere knowing that they didn't have to commute. So that definitely added to the housing shortage and the housing bidding wars that were happening within Toronto. And the last thing that COVID contributed to the crazy housing market was really inventory based. There was not a lot of inventory out there for sale when COVID hit. There was a lot of sellers that did not feel comfortable selling their homes during COVID. And so there was a hesitation on sellers' part to put their homes up for sale. So you had all these buyers coming in because now they wanted something bigger and they wanted a home office, and they also didn't have to commute, so they could move somewhere bigger or move somewhere further out. And yet there wasn't the supply there because all of these sellers were going, wait a minute, I'm not going to be having people in my house during COVID, or I'm not ready to change my housing situation because of COVID. You also had people that weren't traveling, that weren't doing all the things that they were normally doing. And so there was a hesitancy to do things during COVID. And so there was a short supply of housing availability, which actually continues today, but it was much worse then. So that definitely contributed to, the shortage, and then therefore more buyers competing for the same property. So the next thing is demographics, because it's not just the number of people in your population, but it's actually about the people who are ready to buy housing. And in 2021, the largest group of millennials in our population are actually turning 30. And 30 is that magic age where kind of adulthood starts. So you'll see a lot of people deciding to get married, having kids, and becoming homeowners. So millennials being part of the home buying process has definitely had an effect on inventory and the number of buyers that are out there looking for housing. The next thing is our Canadian dollar. Canada is attractive for a lot of reasons. First of all, like I said, it's like one of the safest cities in the world and considered a very safe place to put your money. But on top of that, our Canadian dollar right now is at a discount compared to the US dollar. So when investors are coming into the country, they are actually seeing a safe place to buy, but also a cheaper place to buy because their dollar goes further here than it would in other countries around the world. Speaking of investors, investors definitely have an effect on the housing market in Toronto, in Ontario, and in Canada. Investors make up about 20% of buyers. So that means 1 in 5 buyers is an investor. So what does investor mean? It could mean a lot of different things. It could be an institution buying real estate for their portfolio. It could be an individual buying real estate for their portfolio. It could be somebody buying property to rent it out, or it could be buying property to Airbnb it. There's lots of different ways to define an investor, but generally it means it's somebody who's buying a property and they don't plan to use it as their primary residence. And what happens with investors is that they affect the overall market in Canada and Toronto, especially when it comes to rental housing. So sometimes if an investor is buying and they choose not to live in it, they may not do anything with the property, and then it becomes an issue because then it doesn't become part of housing stock. So it doesn't become a rental and it doesn't become lived in, and so it adds to the shortage. And it's been a big enough problem that Vancouver has actually implemented a tax for empty houses. So in Vancouver, if you buy a house and it sits empty, you get taxed. So investors are being encouraged to rent out those properties versus just leaving them empty. The other thing is with Airbnb and other short-term rentals like that, cities are really being cognizant about that and putting in things to prevent that kind of short-term rental because it's really affecting rental inventory in the city. So in the city of Toronto right now, there's a lot of restrictions about using a property for Airbnb, and a lot of times there's a minimum requirement of 28 days if you're not a specific type of unit. So lots of things in place to try and increase the housing inventory throughout Toronto, Ontario, and Canada, not just for buying, but also for renting. And investors definitely play a big role in all of that. Another thing that affects real estate is money laundering. So money laundering is obviously a criminal activity, and real estate is used by criminals across the world for money laundering. Reason being, it is a large value transaction, and there are some places where, it's easier to do than others. In Canada, the Canadian government has introduced a lot of rules and regulations to try and mitigate money laundering. So there's rules and regulations for the banks, and for us as real estate agents, we have rules and regulations under FinTrack. So we have to identify our clients, we have to identify our relationship with our clients, we have to ensure that, we check ID. There are things like that are part of our process to mitigate crime, but it has been said that crime can add 3 to 5% in value to a market when it comes to real estate. So just something to keep in mind. Again, it's not my area of expertise, but it does affect overall housing activity and value. And another reason why Toronto properties are so popular is that we are considered a highly desirable global destination. Now, The Economist magazine does an annual survey of 60 cities globally, and they rank it on safety. And that safety is across 5 different categories. So digital safety, infrastructure safety, health safety, environmental safety, and then physical safety as well. and Toronto was number 2 on the list. So it continues to be a highly desirable global city because it's a great place to come and invest in. It's a safe place to put your money. And so that's definitely a big contributor to our housing piece, because even in a global pandemic, Toronto has proven to be a place that is a very safe, secure bet for buying housing. So those are the reasons why the Toronto housing market is so crazy and why we have such crazy pricing in some areas. That said, Toronto housing has been pretty consistent across the board. In the last 10 years, the average price of a home has more than doubled, and it continues to appreciate today. And I think for the reasons we just discussed, it's going to continue to appreciate. So people often ask me, do you think it's a crazy time to buy right now? Would you buy in this market? And here's my answer. My answer is yes, and we actually just bought a property last week. So let me tell you why we bought this property. We bought this property in a neighborhood called Yonge and Eglinton. My husband and I used to live there before we had kids, and we loved it when we lived there. We lived in a condo, and it's a very pedestrian neighborhood, so we would walk everywhere, whether it be to the subway or whether it be to restaurants or whether it be to shopping. Everything was within walking distance. And so we knew that when we were at a point in our lives as our kids get older, that, when we didn't need the large home, we would want to move back to Yonge and Eglinton. So we've been keeping our eye out for properties, and a property came up. The property that came up was built in the 80s, which is kind of young for that neighborhood because there's a lot of older, beautiful homes. But this one was built in the 80s, and the sellers were actually the original owners. And they kept immaculate care of this property. It definitely needs updating, but the bones are there and they've taken great care of it. On top of that, it has 2 features that I find very unique to Yonge and Eglinton. One is it has a huge backyard that is pool size. That's very rare in that area. And then 2, it has parking for 3 cars, which again is very rare in that area. Just because it's so pedestrian friendly, you don't get a ton of yardage or parking. So we were thrilled to find that. Now, we bought it last week in this crazy market because we feel like Yonge and Eglinton is a very safe bet to buy a property. We also believe that if for whatever reason we can't move into that property right away, it's also a good area to rent. So we know that the property can rent out if we can't move into it. And then if for some reason something happens, we have to sell that property, we believe that we can fix it up, update it, and sell it and minimize our risk and maybe not lose anything and possibly gain something. But that's kind of the rationale that we made when we bought it. Now, if the market goes down in Toronto, which it could, maybe interest rates will rise, maybe some other things will happen. COVID was totally unexpected. You just never know. We feel like even if Yonge and Eglinton goes down, eventually it'll go back up. And we're in it for the long run, so we feel confident in Toronto real estate that in the long run it's still a safe bet. But you really have to figure out what kind of buyer are you and what's your tolerance level and what's your risk level. And if you're working with a real estate agent, you should talk to them about it and discuss it with them, discuss your goals, and then figure out what is right for you as well. So with that, I hope all of you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe. I would love to hear your comments, so feel free to comment below if you found it helpful or if you disagree with anything, or if you would like to see another video in the future. I would love to hear from you. So with that, have a great day. And if you have any questions about real estate in Toronto, feel free to reach out, call, email, text, or WhatsApp, and we'll take care of you.